It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that glowed with a soft, golden haze through the tall dining room windows. I had just set a plate of cornbread on the oak table. The same table I had sanded and stained nearly 30 years ago, when Marissa walked in. Her heels clicked against the hardwood with a rhythm too sharp for the quiet hour. She didn't greet me. She stood at the end of the table, hands resting on the chair that had always been mine, and said in a voice that left no space for misunderstanding, "This dining room is mine now. You can eat in the laundry area." The words cut through the light and settled heavy in the air. For a moment I thought I had misheard, but her steady gaze told me she meant every syllable. My fingers tightened on the edge of the table, tracing the grain I had once polished with oil and patience. I could have shouted. I could have demanded she leave, but instead, I felt something else, an odd calm. I straightened my back, let my breath steady, and simply looked at her. Marissa's chin lifted as if she had won a battle. But she didn't notice the small curve of my lips. That smile wasn't surrender. It was recognition. She thought she was staking a claim, but she had no idea what she had just awakened. I had weathered greater storms than this. A dining room taken by words was nothing compared to a life rebuilt from ashes. I gathered the cornbread, carried it into the kitchen, and left the table behind. Not because I had lost it, but because I knew I was about to remind her whose house this truly was. After Marissa's words settled in my chest like cold stones, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the cornbread cooling on the counter. My eyes wandered back to the doorway of the dining room, to the table she had tried to claim with a single sentence. That table wasn't just furniture. It was the ledger of my life. I remembered the late 1980s, when Robert and I scraped together enough savings to buy this modest bungalow in Asheville. The neighborhood wasn't fashionable then, but the mountains rose steady on the horizon, and we knew it would be home. We couldn't afford much, but what we bought, we kept, and we built on. When Robert died suddenly, years later, the house became both my anchor and my burden, and I clung to it with everything I had. The dining table came in 1994. It was secondhand, scarred from someone else's years. I saw possibility where others saw ruin. I bought it with money I earned baking 200 carrot cakes, each sold at the Saturday farmers market under a tent that nearly collapsed in the summer storms. My hands ached from grating carrots, my back stiff from carrying bags of flour. But the day I rolled that oak table into the dining room, I felt richer than anyone I knew. I sanded each surface myself, layer by layer, until the wood gleamed like honey. Robert was already gone, but I whispered to him while I worked, promising that this table would hold every holiday, every birthday, every Sunday meal worth remembering, and it did. It became the altar where my family's laughter rose, where tears sometimes fell, where I sat writing checks to keep the lights on. Now someone else wanted to strip it of its meaning, as if 30 years of wood and flour and willpower could be dismissed with one careless decree. I placed my hand on the counter, steadying myself, and knew the next step was not to grieve what she said, but to guard what I had built. It didn't happen all at once. Marissa didn't storm in with boxes and declarations. Instead, she shifted the house piece by piece, like a chess player moving pawns before revealing the real game. The first time I noticed, it was the chairs. I came into the dining room one morning and found them rearranged, angled differently, pulled farther from the table as if waiting for guests I hadn't invited. When I asked about it, Marissa smiled politely. "It makes the room feel more open." Don't you think I nodded, though inside I felt something had been nudged out of place. Then came the pantry. I'd always kept spices in one row, flowers and sugars in another. It was my order. learned from years of baking before dawn. One afternoon, I opened the door to find everything in new containers, labels neatly written in her handwriting. "So much more functional," she said, as if I'd been running a mess instead of a business. I didn't argue. I simply moved what I needed back into reach. The house grew quieter, too. Not by nature, but by decree. She began to declare quiet hours in the mornings, claiming that the sound of my stand mixer carried upstairs and disturbed her sleep. My work had always begun before sunrise. Weddings and birthdays don't wait for convenience. Still, I softened the noise where I could, running my machines at lower speed, padding around the kitchen in slippers to spare the floors. One evening, as I carried laundry through the hallway, I caught her voice drifting from the porch where she spoke on the phone. "Once the deed's updated, we'll redo this whole dining room," she said, her tone light, confident. My chest tightened, but I kept walking. Marcos noticed none of it or pretended not to. When I mentioned the pantry, he only shrugged. "She likes things organized." "What's the harm?" His eyes flicked away from mine, heavy with the weight of being caught in between. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the words echoing in my mind. Once the deed's updated, she wasn't just rearranging furniture, she was rearranging ownership, and I needed to decide whether to confront her illusions now or quietly gather the proof that would end them. The morning after I overheard Marissa's words, I pulled a battered shoebox from the hall closet. Inside were years of envelopes, folded notices, and receipts I had saved out of habit more than purpose. I carried it to the dining table, the very one she dreamed of redesigning, and began to spread them across the polished surface. The deed came first, its ink still crisp, though signed decades ago. Evelyn May Hartwell, sole owner. Next, the tax bill stamped paid in full, proof of the check I had written only weeks before. I sorted through utility statements: Duke Energy, Asheville City Utilities, Piedmont Gas, all neatly addressed to me, month after month, year after year. It was my name that kept the house alight, the faucets running, the rooms warm in winter. Marissa's name was nowhere. Marcos's either. The silence of those pages spoke louder than any argument. That afternoon, I carried a stack across the street to Dolores Kemp, my neighbor of 20 years. She spread them out on her coffee table, squinting through her glasses. Dolores had been a nurse before her husband passed. She had no patience for nonsense. "Lord, Evelyn," she said, tapping the deed with her finger, "you're not their maid. You're their landlord, and they don't even pay rent." Her words landed hard, sharper than she likely intended. I had been cooking, cleaning, and absorbing their slights as though gratitude was still owed from me. But gratitude was not a debt to be paid forever. Dolores leaned back, folding her arms. "You've been footing every bill, and they strut around like owners. Maybe it's time you show them who signs the checks." I walked home with the folder tucked tight against my chest. For the first time in months, my shoulders felt lighter. The proof was here, in black and white. It wasn't anger that steadied me, but clarity. And clarity always comes before action. By Friday morning, the decision had settled in me like stone. I had weighed it from every side, run my fingers over the edges of guilt and obligation. But in the end, it was simple. I dialed the bank. The line crackled. A polite woman answered, and I gave her the account number. My throat tightened for a breath. But when I spoke, my voice carried without a tremor. "Cancel all payments on my son's house loan. Effective immediately." There was a pause on the other end, keys tapping. She repeated the instruction back, asked if I was certain. I said I was. Then, with one last click, the current I had kept flowing for years was cut off. When I hung up, I stood in the kitchen, listening to the hush that followed. It felt as though the house itself had exhaled, relieved to no longer be held hostage by my silence. My hands trembled, but it wasn't fear. It was release. For so long, I had convinced myself that paying for Marcos and Marissa's life was love, that covering the bills was part of my duty as a mother. Now I saw it for what it was, a chain I had forged with my own devotion. That evening, I laid the evidence across the dining table. The bills, opened and marked, arranged in a straight line. The deed, heavy with my name, sat at the center like a crown. I left them there, untouched, as the late sun slanted through the windows. Anyone who walked in would see the truth displayed in plain numbers. It didn't take long. Near 7, the phone rang. Marcos's voice came tight, strained. "Mom, what happened with the bank?" Marissa's card was declined at the Grove Park Inn. She tried to book dinner, and it bounced. "She's furious." I let the words hang before answering. "Yes. Something happened. You'll both come here tonight. We'll talk at the table." He started to protest, but I ended the call and sat back down, resting my palm against the polished oak. This table had carried birthday candles and unpaid debts, laughter and grief. Tonight it would carry the truth. The numbers would speak louder than pride, and no one, least of all Marissa, would be able to turn away. The house waited with me, quiet, steady, as if it too knew that nothing inside these walls would ever be the same again. By the time Marcos and Marissa walked through the door, the dining room was already staged. The bills lay in neat rows across the table, each envelope sliced open. Numbers circled in pen. I had taken my seat at the head, not out of vanity but out of habit, the way Robert used to, the way I had since he passed. Marissa's heels clicked on the wood floor. She glanced at the spread with narrowed eyes, then at me. Marcos shifted beside her. His tie loosened, the long day at the office written in the slump of his shoulders. "Sit," I said, and to my surprise, they did. I picked up the first page. Duke Energy $240 last month. Asheville City. Utilities 150. Spectrum. Internet 110. Piedmont Gas 95. Groceries about 200. Sometimes more when you have company. I let the words drop like stones. One by one, Marissa's expression flickered. "Marcos pays those," she said quickly, almost defensive. I slid the papers closer to her. "Look at the name. Every bill is mine. Every check has been mine. For years." Her lips parted. But no words came. Marcos leaned forward, scanning the pages, his face coloring as if each line item exposed him. He swallowed hard. "Mom, I thought you thought wrong." I said, steady, but not cruel. "You've both been living here without paying a dime." I covered it, quietly, because I believed family should lift each other. But family doesn't demand. Family respects. Marissa sat back, stunned, her hands tightening around the armrests. Marcos kept staring at the numbers as though they were foreign text. I drew in a slow breath, then delivered what needed saying. "If you want this table, you contribute. If not, you leave. Those are the terms." The silence that followed was thick, stretching long across the polished oak. Marissa's eyes flashed, ready to object. But the bills between us spoke louder than she could. Marcos looked from her to me, caught in a truth he could no longer ignore. I waited, unflinching, knowing this was only the beginning of their reckoning. Marissa's voice rose first, sharp as broken glass. "You wouldn't charge your own family. No decent mother would." I kept my gaze steady on hers. "Families who respect each other share the load. This isn't charity, Marissa. It's survival. I've carried this house long enough on my own." She laughed, bitter and brittle. "So you want us to write you checks, is that it? You want to humiliate us?" "No," I said evenly. I want you to recognize what it costs to live here. You can't demand control of a room when you've never paid for the roof above it." Marcos shifted in his chair, his hands pressed together as if in prayer. He tried to cut in, but I leaned forward and fixed my eyes on him. "You need to decide. Son, do you want a wife who shares or a wife who takes? Because I won't be the third party in this marriage any longer." He dropped his gaze to the table. The bills fanned out before him like judgment. Marissa's cheeks flushed deep red. She shoved her chair back so hard it scraped against the floor, then disappeared upstairs. Moments later, I heard drawers opening. The hollow thud of a suitcase pulled from the closet. Marcos rubbed his forehead, his voice low. "Mom, maybe we can just give her time." The sound of footsteps echoed above us, fast and angry. A zipper pulled, then silence. I sat back, my fingers still resting on the oak surface I had sanded years ago, the table that had outlasted grief and sacrifice. I knew the choice was hers to make now. She could walk out with pride in her suitcase, or she could set it down and learn what it meant to stay. The weight of that decision lingered in the air as I rose from the chair and braced myself for what the next morning would bring. The next morning, the suitcase was still in the hallway, half-zipped, clothes spilling from the edges like it had been abandoned mid-decision. Marissa came down the stairs slower than usual, her eyes rimmed red, her voice stripped of its sharpness. "I thought," she began, fingers twisting the strap of her bag, "if I controlled the dining room, I'd matter more. People come in and out. They see that table, that space. I wanted it to feel like mine." Her confession landed heavier than her insults ever had. Pride had been her armor, but envy had been her fuel. I set down the dish towel in my hands and looked her straight on. "The dining room isn't about power, Marissa. It's about respect. You don't earn that by claiming a chair. You earn it by sharing the weight of this house." She nodded, though her chin quivered, for the first time since she crossed my threshold. She looked less like a rival and more like someone still learning how to stand on her own. "I'll give you 1 month, I said. 1 month to show respect, to contribute, to live here as part of the household. After that, if it's the same, you leave. No arguments." Marissa pressed her lips together, but she didn't object. She simply whispered, "All right." That afternoon, I pulled my old aprons from the sewing basket. They were worn thin in places, stained with flour and sugar, reminders of years when baking kept this roof steady. I cut and stitched until a new runner stretched the length of the dining table. When I laid it down, the room felt whole again. That evening, I sat at the head seat without hesitation. The oak gleamed beneath the soft fabric, and for the first time in weeks, the chair felt like it had been waiting for me all along. By the end of the month, the air in the house felt lighter. Marissa kept her word, but I could see the unease in her. She wanted space that belonged to her, not borrowed respect under my roof. Marcos finally began searching in earnest, and together they found a small rental near downtown Asheville, close enough to walk to his office and far enough to test their own strength. One Saturday afternoon, they came by carrying a white envelope. Marissa handed it to me without the edge that used to lace her words. "Our first rent and utilities," she said softly. "We paid it ourselves." Inside was a simple receipt, itemized and unremarkable to anyone else. To me, it was a declaration. The numbers were theirs, not mine. And for the first time, they understood what it meant to shoulder a household. Marcos added, "You taught us the math of respect." "Mom," I should have realized sooner. I placed the envelope on the table beside a framed slip of paper, the cancellation notice from the bank. I had kept it, not out of spite, but as a reminder of the moment the balance shifted back to me. That single act had redrawn the lines in this family more clearly than years of silence ever had. We shared coffee in the kitchen before they left. The conversation easier than it had been in months. When their car pulled away, I walked back inside. The house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. The walls seemed to exhale, as if they too had been waiting for this release. I stood in the dining room, my hand brushing the table runner, and wondered what it meant to have finally passed the weight back where it belonged. The following Sunday, I prepared the dining room as I once had in better years. The oak table gleamed beneath the new runner, and the air carried the scent of roasted chicken and fresh bread. Neighbors brought casseroles. Friends from church carried pies. And a few of my longtime clients arrived with flowers as thanks for the orders I had filled through every season of their lives. The house filled with conversation, the kind that rose and fell like music. Gentle laughter, clinking glasses. Stories of children and gardens and weather. I moved easily between the kitchen and the dining room, not as a servant, but as a host. Steady and sure of my place. When everyone finally sat, I took my seat at the head without hesitation. No one contested it. No one even thought to. I looked down the length of the table, past the faces of those who respected the roof they sat under, and felt a calm I hadn't known in months. Boundaries weren't revenge. They were survival. They were the line that kept dignity intact and love from curdling into resentment. I raised my glass, not for a speech, but for a simple acknowledgement. The clatter quieted, and I said only what needed to be said. My table, my rules, my peace. The words were not defiance, but truth. Anchored in the wood beneath my hand, the table had held me through grief and through battles, and now it held me in peace. As voices rose again around me, I leaned back in my chair, the head of the table exactly where I was meant to be. When you stop paying for disrespect, which rooms in your life become yours again?